Today, we are talking about something really vital, and that is how to make innovation part of the everyday. Not something that's an add on, but actually embedding it in your business and your culture. And I'd ask our listeners to just have a think, is innovation at your workplace a buzzword or actually a behavior? And think of the last time that somebody raised a suggestion in your team or in your organization, and did it get buried in the bureaucracy of the culture? Or was it actually given room to breathe? Was it heard? Was it tried out? Was it tested? And when innovation is sporadic or non-existent, that is when organizations are going to fall behind and struggle against the other organizations that do encourage that innovation and that continual improvement and that discovery of new ways of working, new ways of thinking and delivering value to customers. So today we're going to demystify innovation and see it not as a lightning bolt, but as a capability that anybody can build within the organization. We want to help you do that today. So Andrew, you work with teams that make things happen every day. Why do you think organizations struggle so often to innovate continuously and bring that into the organization?
Great question, Scott. And you're right. A lot of organizations that I work with, and I'm sure you're the same, innovation is one of those buzz phrases that people throw around in organizations, and leaders and managers often say that they want their teams to be more innovative and we want you to be more creative. And I think one of the core problems and why it falls down, and this is what we can talk about in this episode, is there's a difference between, if you like, creativity and idea generation and innovation. So idea generation is that spark, that light bulb moment. Have you ever noticed on any presentation, if anybody suggests the idea of innovation, they always have a light bulb,
Oh yeah, bring out the thumbnail, the clip art.
The thumbnail, the Microsoft stock images on PowerPoint is always a light bulb. So there's this concept of creativity, which is where you suddenly go, I know, it's that sort of eureka moment. You have an idea in the shower or wherever. It's always in the shower as well. If you notice, people say, always have my best ideas in the shower. We should have meetings. No, I was going to say we have meetings in the shower. That sounds bad. That wouldn't be allowed in the modern workplace. But so creativity is this idea of having sparks of ideas, and that's brilliant. Innovation, though, and we're going to talk about this, I think, is a process. So innovation is a systematic process. It's defined. We start, middle, and end of this process. So there's a confusion. So going back to your question, I think that's why innovation is often sought out by organizations. It's often demanded by leaders and managers. We need to be more innovative, but it fails because we don't understand that distinction between the spark and the process. And can I give you a personal example? I worked in an organization a few years ago, and they got all of us into a conference center, and it must have cost a fortune because there were several, probably 100 of us, I suppose. And we had this whole day, classic, whiteboards, flip charts, post-it notes, pens on the table, the sort of thing I'm talking about. And there was a demand, biscuits. Lots of biscuits, which is great, breakout. Everybody loved it. It was a good day, actually. We all enjoyed ourselves. But the thing that the organization wanted was ideas. And the ideas were all for revenue generation. And we came up with ideas. We came up with loads of ideas, and we spent the entire day coming up with ideas. Now, the shortened version of this is that nothing actually happened, because innovation is also around execution. So what we're talking about on this particular episode is understanding what innovation is. And what I'd say, before I ask your opinion, is, there's a statistic that, managers and leaders realize or say that innovation comes from culture and people. So really what we need to think about is, how do we get culture and people to work together to generate that process of innovation? So if I asked you, Scott, in your experience, how would leaders and organizations model that behavior so that they actually start getting this kind of innovative culture?
Well, I think people need to see, firstly, the key thing is innovation, in my view, is only innovation if it actually delivers something at the end. We can be, and again, I think the term is misused, as you said, into, well, we're innovative if we've created something new and creative. And that's fine. But if you launch something new and creative and you spend thousands of pounds on it and you deliver it and you launch it and the customers don't use it, is it still innovative? I'd argue it's only innovative if it actually makes a difference and it delivers. And we talk quite a lot on this show about outcomes over output, something I'm really passionate
Yes.
about. And I think the same applies to innovation. It actually has to be something that delivers the value at the end of the day and can be measured. And leaders, as you say, will throw around, will be more innovative. And then you come to the challenge, well, okay, are we clear on what the outcome should be and might be, may not be, and that's fine. We may need to test that idea. And we'll touch on today how we do that using a 6-stage cycle. Talk about that in a minute. But also have leaders given the culture and trust that needs to happen for that for those ideas to flourish. Because I'm sure in your experience in that, a lot of those ideas were probably poo-pooed and people thought, oh, we can't do that. That's too risky. Or, oh, that's going to cost too much money. Or what about our bureaucracy that's going to get in the way of that? And that's how innovation can be killed before it even gets out the door.
Well, it's funny you said about some of those ideas. I can, as you were talking, I remember that day very fondly because it was such a good day with lots of biscuits. But people came up with ideas such as, why don't we run a petrol station? Because petrol stations make a lot of money. I don't know whether they do or not. And then there was another idea of, why don't we open a golf course? Now, I'm not exaggerating. These were some of the ideas that people came up with, but they weren't particularly innovative. They were just creative in the sense of, well, that'd be different for this organization to run a golf course, wouldn't it? But they weren't innovative. They didn't really add any value to the end customer that we had. They didn't add any value to the value proposition for the organization. So yeah, there's absolutely got to be a clarity in between what is really different, but makes a difference to the business, makes a difference to the customer. Yeah. That's something that we have to really be focused on, and we need to understand. I think what we're sort of in this conversation already identifying. There's a confusion here about what innovation actually means. Would you agree, in your experience with organisations, that there's that definite confusion about what we mean to be innovative?
Yeah, it's become for many, I think, just that another term that gets thrown around. Because you can be, again, I come back to innovative, but only if it is the right thing to do and it delivers an outcome at the end.
Scott, you've got your 6-stage cycle of innovation. What is that? I've heard of this before.
Yep. So the first thing is capture. So capture those ideas, because great ideas go nowhere without an engine. Actually, we want to develop something called idea management, and management could have some negative connotations, but it's actually providing a structure and a cycle where these ideas the valid ideas that are going to be powerful, the innovation that's going to be effective, can flourish. So first stage is capture. So capture those ideas in a place where they're visible and it's accessible and people can understand it and start to have conversations. Evaluate those ideas. So starting to kind of first pass at them and say, do we think there's something here? Yeah, we think there's something, maybe some competitors have done something similar that's worked, or there's just a gut feeling that actually this might be the right thing for us to do. And then, of course, we talked about this before, prioritise, because as you've said, your experience, hundreds of ideas were generated. You can't do them all. So you then need to prioritise based on the criteria that we've talked about before in other shows around, viability, capacity, all those other things. And then develop those ideas. So start to develop them, start to try them out, and get them out as early as possible. So again, in our previous episode about agility, testing, implementing things, getting a rough version out there to try and get some early feedback, and then review that and say, do we think this has some potential? And then you will go through that cycle again. Do we want to build on that? How do we improve? How do we iterate again? And then continue prioritization. So again, it's bringing in a bit of agility here. So just to summarize again, capture, evaluate, prioritize, develop, implement, and review.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And going back to my experience there with the golf course, and these are genuine ideas that people had, there was definitely a capture process there. We were capturing ideas. There wasn't really a great evaluation process, and then it just tailed off. And I'm not exaggerating when I say nothing came from that day. Nothing at all. Nothing of value, because we had this frothy generation, and it was a lot of fun, and people were laughing and enjoying themselves, and we all had a good time. but nothing came out of that day. What a waste of energy. And I suppose the danger here is that innovation itself gets a bad name.
Mm.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same. Yeah. How many of those people left and thought, well, that was a waste of our time. There's no point ever coming up with another good idea again, so I'm not going to bother.
I think if people said, we're going to have another away day, they could have come up with another 100 ideas. But the organization didn't have this process. So I love that. So again, just to remind me, you've got your capture process, you then evaluate. So you capture the ideas, you evaluate, you prioritize, you develop the ideas. How would you develop those ideas then? How could you talk through how you think you develop those ideas then?
So again, that's down to actually getting, say, a small team together, giving them permission to take some risks, to try and experiment. Is again back to that culture of experimentation and testing to fail, almost to say how, test it, try it out, get some early feedback as early as possible, and without the bureaucracy that normally sits above these things. And that is hard for leadership to let go of, because we need to have a paper trail. We need to have countless meetings about this to, make sure we're safe. But I would often argue that the risk is not taking action, not trying these ideas out. The risk isn't spending 12 months beating an idea to death before you even try to implement something. So I think out of the 6, implement and review are probably the 2 most important parts. It's actually getting something out there and making sure you then review and get feedback on that and say, has this thing we're testing got legs? If not, try something else. Test that. Has that got legs? If not, try something else. And doing that in small bite-sized chunks.
That's right. It reminded us something. I do a bit of comedy improv. Would you believe?
We'll have to have a separate show for that, Andrew.
We'd have to have a separate show for that, definitely. I'm not very good, but one of the core tenets of improv is the yes and statement. So if you've never done any improv or you've never seen any improv, if I throw you an idea, you don't say no, you say yes and it's that attitude. And I sort of want to come on to this in terms of the culture you mentioned. Organizations need to have a yes and attitude rather than a no but. And many organizations, in my experience, are idea killing machines. A good idea. Going back to my experience with that away day, a lot of them were not good ideas. They were not good ideas. But I'm sure there was a few nuggets of decent ideas in there. So I think this process that you've outlined in it, I think is really, really rare for organizations to have a process. I don't know about you, but I don't know many organizations I've worked with have a process for innovation. Do you? Do you have that experience that teams have a process for innovation?
No, they only loosely would use the word process. They have to submit a very big, long bureaucratic business case for any idea. It goes to the boardroom and then it dies, or it gets kicked around and then find many reasons not to do something. There's just the barrier to entry is the hurdle that so many of these good ideas, I think, don't even get that far because the employees are they got no hope. It's like, why bother? And then compound on top the stuff that we talk about in other shows around bureaucracy and busyness and all those things. They just haven't got anything left to give. And they know that why would I pour that effort into this bureaucracy to get an idea that I know will be really good? Because there's no point. So
that's right. That's so right, Scott. Now I'm reminded of another story from my long and glorious career. When I was doing my degree, I did an internship. It wasn't called an internship then, with Ford. And I worked for 4 months at a car plant. And if you ever have the chance to go around a car plant, it's fascinating to go around and see cars being produced. But I worked in the HR department, and one of our functions or one of our jobs was to manage the idea schemes, the employee suggestion scheme. And it was a bit like the process you outlined there. There was a capture process. And at that time, people could actually put suggestions in a suggestions box. This is how long ago this was. This is like 25, 30 years ago. But some of the ideas were really good. And one of the ideas that came up, and this is what I want to lead on to in terms of culture, is if you came up with a good idea and it actually saved the organization money, you would get, I think it was like 5% of the savings. And one of the best ideas, one of the most cost-saving ideas, the best cost-saving idea that I saw was they used to have these huge sort of warehouses with parts for the factory floor. And at that time, the lights were on 24/7. So guess what somebody came up with? Motion sensors for the lights. And at the top of my head, I think it saved the business like £250,000. I mean, electricity prices are even higher now, but it saved that one plant like £250,000 from just turning the lights off when nobody was walking around that part of the warehouse. And that guy got, I think it was like 5% of that. Do the maths. It was worth having. So, and that leads me on to something else that you touched upon, is leadership is so important in this. You have to have leaders that are going to create, first of all, my favorite term, which is psychological safety. And if you don't know that term, it's the idea that people feel safe within the organization. They don't just literally mean from physical violence, but they trust each other. So as a leader, for you to get innovation, true innovation in your organization, you have to generate that culture of trust. And you have to sort of have everybody feeling that innovation is everybody's job. It's not just, somebody over there is the innovator and I just get on with my job. As a leader, you want to encourage your team to feel that anybody can innovate at any level. And I was working with a team just recently, and one of those meetings where there's always one or two people who talk the most. I think most meetings, there's somebody that talks an awful lot. And I was sort of managing this meeting, and I noticed in the meeting there was this quite junior person, and she had said very little. She's quite shy. So I actually stopped the meeting, or stopped the flow of conversation. And I turned to this person, I said, have you got anything? I'd like your contribution. And she had one of those, what you'd call drop the mic moments. She just paused, and she'd clearly been thinking about this for some time, but hadn't got the confidence to say and to contribute at that point. And she just came up with a suggestion. And when you've had one of those moments where everybody just like stops, there's like an intake of breath, when we just sort of reflect upon the genius of what somebody's just said. It's never happened to me, by the way. It's never happened to me. I never get that. But she came up with this idea, and we just all went, wow, that's really good. And it was a genius idea. I can't obviously share what it was, but it was an absolutely fantastic idea. So the point I'm making is we need leaders to create that culture of safety and trust, but also encourage everybody to feel that they can contribute. Everybody can actually contribute to this process of innovation. Ideas can come from anywhere. So if I asked you then, Scott, how would you see that culture translating into actual innovation workflows? Have you got any sort of, little tips and tricks that people can start with? Any sort of tools? Or you mentioned that overall process, but are there any sort of other workflows that you would recommend?
Yeah, so we talked about leaders in respect to employees suggesting ideas to leaders and how leaders embrace that or kill that idea. Before I come on to some more of those approaches, I also want to point out that I've seen many times, and I'm sure you have as well, Andrew, that the leaders themselves can fall into what I call the shiny trap. So on the basis of that, the example you've just given, how quite a junior member of the organization came up with a killer idea, I've seen quite often that, and I've said this before, the closer the person is to the customer, the more knowledgeable they are, the more experienced they are. And what tends to happen is they're the ones with the best ideas. What can happen is the leaders think they should have the best ideas, and the leaders quite often are the most out of touch. And I've seen all too often where leaders fall into the shiny trap and say, well, this is shiny. This is the latest cool tech, for example, because I've worked in the tech space quite a lot. I've seen leaders fall into that trap and think, well, this is the cool thing that everyone's shouting about, so we must use that, without realizing or even questioning themselves, is it the right thing for us? Is it the right thing for our organization? Is it still in the hype cycle? And actually, I've seen all too often where the leaders are doing the shiny thing because it looks cool and it makes them look good in the boardroom because they're talking about this fancy tech or a shiny idea. And then the rest of the organization just get told, this is what we're doing. And you've got the quieter voices who are closer going, no, this is not going to work for our customers. We know this is not going to land with our customers. So actually there's like this enforced, and I'm going to not call it innovation because the leaders think it is, but it's not. And they can essentially make it worse because they're falling into that shiny trap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you just made me think that I think there's a psychological reasons why leaders do that. Often we're looking outwards as a leader, and that's our job. If anybody's listening to this and you are a leader, part of your job is to look outwards, is to look at the the PESTOR analysis, I can never remember all the letters stand for. PESTOR, politics, economic, societal. I probably got those totally wrong, but people are, as leaders, encouraged to look outwards. And the trouble is, if you're looking outwards completely, you're not looking back at the organization. You're not seeing the resource that you have. So sometimes leaders feel that pressure to look outwards rather than inwards. And I think we also take what we've got for granted. We forget how talented the people that we have are, and they can innovate. They just need a bit of help. They might need a process you mentioned. They need some tools, which I think you're going to talk about. Yeah, but we forget the quality of the people that we've already got. And I think the other thing psychologically, before I hand back to what you were going to talk about in terms of the process, is that imposter syndrome. And you and I are often hard on leaders but then again, we've both been leaders. We know how difficult it can be to be a leader. Leaders and managers have that imposter thing where they think their job is to be a genius. They think their job is to have all of the ideas. Sure, there's some leaders that have the ego that they think they have all the ideas, but they feel the pressure to be special. They feel the pressure to come up with those sparks of genius. And that forces them sometimes to try and tell people what to do. So I think there's probably a lot of reasons. But yeah, you're right. I think leaders can end up chasing the latest fad. The number of companies that must be having discussions about AI implementation at the moment. And maybe if people listen to this in like 10 years' time, they go, yeah, because they were right. And AI has replaced all of us. But there are so many leaders now chasing the AI, down the AI rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the leaders have got a key responsibility in creating this innovation process. Have you got some sort of simple things or straightforward things people can do to start being more innovative?
So the first thing is to try and put yourself in the customer's perspective. And there's something called jobs to be done theory, which is actually the example given is the customer doesn't want a hammer and a nail. They want a picture on the wall to look at. So it's not just about the tools, it's about the outcome the customer wants and solving customer problems. And finding innovative ways to do that is key, and not just build the shiny stuff that I've been talking about. And too many leaders, I think, fall into the safe bet. So it's actually, this one's, we kind of done this before, so this is not risky, so we'll do that one. But you could be missing an opportunity. So I think the best leaders, their job, as we talked about, you were saying about the leaders think they have to be, perfect and have all the answers. And again, very early in my career, I've shared this before in other episodes that I thought I had to have all the answers. Now I say, no, team, you have the answers. You're the smart people. You tell me. My job as a leader is to ask the right questions and actually, give the team the safe place and to flourish these ideas, to try them out, to test them. But also challenge some of those ideas and say, well, what job is this really solving? What problem is this solving for our customers? How can we prove that? How can we test it? How can we get customer feedback? Involve them in the process, depending on the nature of the organization. Involve them in those innovation discussions. But again, you have to have the awareness that what a customer will say in a workshop environment or survey is quite often different to reality, which is back to what we've been talking about before, is get into the hands. So get those ideas into the hands. And then we talked again about prioritization. So is there a framework in place where you can actually prioritize these ideas? So there's a prioritization framework around scoring ideas versus effort and impact. So actually, if it requires a lot of effort and low impact, compare that to something that's minimal effort and high impact. You know which one you would prioritize higher. So using different ways to prioritize. And again, some people may have heard of squads within Spotify. I don't know if they still use it the same way they did, but just building small innovative teams, giving them permission to try and experiment, again, without that bureaucracy at the top. And there's a stat that, and we can use the agile term again, but agile organizations are 60% more likely to see innovation success. Actually, and I've been there and I've helped nurture that with teams in the past. There's this buzz, there's this feeling of excitement and shared ownership and collaborative working, which is this blend of autonomy and alignment in terms of we're on this mission together. We've got the safety, the overhead protection to be innovative, and the danger of overusing the word here, but to actually try those things out and be creative. Sometimes you may have these pet projects where a senior leader has said, this is what we're going to do. and then just get stuck on it. And well, we've come so far, we're going to keep going and not actually reviewing what's working, what isn't. What have you seen happen in your experience?
Yeah, I have seen organizations chase ideas that I think almost at the start most people realized was a bad idea, but they continue. The number of times I've been involved in organizations that have done a rebrand. How many times have we tried? How many rebrands are we going to have? This is not a great idea. The rebrand isn't going to fix the core problem. And you're a big fan of customer value. I'm obviously a big fan too. What matters to the customer? What's going to increase the value proposition for the organization? Those are the ideas that we should focus on. That's where the innovation process should be focused, is on that customer value. So I think what happens is you get something called in psychology the sunk cost fallacy. I don't know if you've heard of this term, but the sunk cost fallacy is once we've started down a particular path, and it's human nature, but organizations obviously are full of people, is we tend to carry on with it. Often it might be a good idea and then great, but often we realize that this isn't a great idea, but we put so much time in, we put so much effort in, we put so much money in, we carry on anyway. And the sunk cost fallacy is we've sunk costs into this. It's a bit like the classic example is, we joined a queue in the post office and there's like 3 lines to join, and you join this one because you think it's going to be the quickest, and then the other line starts to move quicker than yours, and you think, oh, I've been standing in this line now for 5 minutes, I'm going to stay in this line. So I think that's one of the key problems, and that's a human fallacy. And so really what we're talking here is that leaders have to understand innovation. They have to understand it's a process, but they have to invest in that innovation process. They have to protect the innovation process. And what that means is we are going to have this process. We're going to give airtime to it. We're going to give resources to it. We're going to give training to people to do this. And we're going to accept that some of these ideas will not work. But we're going to have, like you've mentioned very helpfully, things like prioritization frameworks. We're going to try agile. We're going to do test and learn. But it really depends on those leaders believing in innovation and protecting the process of innovation. And the other job of leaders is to encourage people to understand why we're trying to be innovative. I mentioned that away day that I talk about. There wasn't really a sort of reason why. And Simon Sinek, the thought leader, he talks about having a why. Why do you want your teams to be innovative? Why do we need to be innovative? You need to sell that as a leader. There has to be something in it for the team. So this conference I talk about, there was a desperation pretty much on the organization's part to generate more revenue, but that revenue wasn't going to be shared with the team. Now, you might say, well, it's their job to come up with ideas. But in the back of people's minds is, why should I give you a good idea if it's not going to make my job easier? Why should I give you a good idea unless I'm going to get some sort of maybe financial benefit or a promotion? So leadership has to have that vision. It has to have that process, but it also has to have that reciprocal arrangement. We want you to be innovative. You will benefit as well. We both benefit, the organization and the individual, and that's the job of the leader. Do you got any sort of final ideas that we can offer people to start getting that innovation process working in their teams?
Yeah, so some suggestions include blocking out 30 minutes this week for the team to have an idea session where, just make it a small team, low pressure, high energy, maybe some biscuits. They always go down well, or they'll always caveat that then people have a crash afterwards. So maybe some healthy fruit. I don't know. But making that space, but that has to, as we've said, come with support and not just be, oh, here we go again. We're just being asked for ideas because the organization keeps saying that, we keep telling the organization it's not listening to us. But actually, this brief idea session, capture the ideas, go through the 6 stages that we've talked about, and we'll list those 6 stages in the show notes for you for easy reference. And ask the team for a challenge. For example, if we had to double our impact without doubling our budget, what would we try? Also, innovation is going to have some guardrails around it, so some constraints. And I don't want constraint to sound negative, but as you've said in the example you gave of the golf course idea, that just wasn't feasible. So actually putting some guidance around, what ideas and innovation is likely to be welcomed and acceptable, but balancing that with the creative freedom to encourage people to, dare I say, the cliche, think outside the box. So there's a tension there, but I think it's just landing that right as well. Andrew, do you have any final thoughts so that we can wrap this topic up with today?
Yeah, we are in a very, very difficult business environment. The world is crazy. It seems to get crazier by the minute. If you don't watch the news, it's so depressing. So organizations have to be more innovative. They have to understand what innovation is. They have to build it into processes. So for me, and what you and I have been talking about, is we have to understand that innovation is a mindset. It's an attitude within the organization. It's about having that curiosity. It's about encouraging people to be creative. It's about having a bit of courage as well within the organization, and certainly from the leadership, about being brave, trying new things out, being agile. But primarily it's for the team to feel safe and building that sense of psychological safety. We are allowed to try things out. We are allowed to try new ideas out. Maybe there's a bit of a budget to try things out, doing that agile test and learn thing. And if all you can start with is just saying to your team, what's one idea this week we can try? Just one idea. And as a manager, and if you are a manager or a leader, have that yes and attitude rather than the no but. And over time, I think you'll see that innovation becomes normal in your organization and you'll start to move forward in so many ways. Thank you for listening to the Work Unravelled podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next one.
If you'd like Andrew or me to help you or your business, whether it is for team productivity, leadership coaching, or communication skills, our website addresses are in the show notes. Thanks, and until the next time.